5 kilometers from the Union Carbide factory. To get to the factory, you'd go down Idga Hill, a hill so steep that cars would often cut their engine and just roll down. You'd go past the butchers advertising their chickens and every so often an exotic turkey. And you'd pass Bada Talab, Bhopal's gorgeous central lake. Here you'd take a left. Here the buildings become a little smaller as they're built closer and closer together until you realize that they were built by their occupants. And as you're facing the colorful neighborhood of JP Nagar, you almost don't notice what it faces: a white wall with an orange border. Inside the wall is Union Carbide, an abandoned American pesticide factory. Inside the wall are rusted pipes, cracked concrete, overgrown weeds. Every so often, cows wander in to graze on this land. More often than not, they end up dead, choking on the same poison that killed 10,000 people the night of December 2nd, 1984. I took my first breath in this very air. Born in 1995, less than 3 years after my father picked up his compensation check from Union Carbide, I grew up never having heard of the Bhopal Gas Tragedy, never having known that I was born into a family that had narrowly escaped death as neighbors fled in flight of an invisible gas. I never heard of the Bhopal Gas Tragedy until 7th grade, sitting in a social studies class 8,000 miles away in Memphis, Tennessee. Not until I read a line in my social studies textbook after a paragraph on Chernobyl that said, and the second worst industrial disaster in the world was Bhopal. What had happened in Bhopal, and why did no one talk about it? Motivated to understand this profound silence, I decided to return to Bhopal as a Fulbright scholar trained in anthropology. I knew that I would be both an insider and an outsider, neither native nor foreign. I understood going into this research that I would be as much of a participant as I was an observer, that I was trying to understand my own story as much as I was trying to understand the story of others and how we all fit together. I spent the next 9 months with gas survivors of every caste, class, and religion, including my grandfather, a retired judge, and Rashida B., one of the fiercest activists I have ever met. At Chingari School, an institution she co-founded to serve disabled children, Rashida B. told me her story. Her life began hand-rolling cigarettes, never having spoken to a man unrelated to her. She never learned how to read or write. Her world was her makeshift home in the slums of Bhopal until the night of December 2nd, 1984. Here she is in her own words.
We were getting sleepy when we heard people screaming, "Run!" outside. A nephew came in and said that some chilies factory had caught on fire, and so we all have to go or else we all die. Every time we tried to open our eyes, we saw people falling and running over other humans. No one cared for anyone else. I could hear myself praying for death. Allah, grant me death, grant me death.
Union Carbide was an American household name, creator of Energizer batteries, Glad trash bags, and pesticides. In the 60s, Union Carbide decided to capitalize on India's booming population with a factory in Bhopal to manufacture its trademark pesticide, 7. In Bhopal, they built a factory large enough to accommodate their ambition, but lean enough to accommodate their budget. A key ingredient for 7 was methyl isocyanate, a highly unstable gas, so dangerous that many countries around the world had banned its use. Toxic to the eyes and lungs, methyl isocyanate is 500 times more poisonous than hydrogen cyanide. To remain a stable liquid, MIC had to be kept at very low temperatures in rust-resistant tanks, and most importantly, it had to be kept away from water. But demand for pesticide never neared what Union Carbide expected. By 1984, stores of MIC were building up. Training time for employees had been cut from 6 months to 6 weeks to deal with constant turnover, and alarms have been turned off because they sounded too often. Instead, workers reported that they detected issues with their own bodies. When their eyes began to water, they knew there must be a leak. The night of December 2nd, during a standard cleaning job, someone sent water into a tank that hadn't been touched in months. A tank that was not properly refrigerated, a tank that had slowly been rusting, and a tank with a deadly poison that reacts violently to water. Within 2 hours, 43 metric tons of MIC had escaped. Denser than the air around it, MIC sank. While all of Bhopal suffered that night, the low-lying slums across the street from the factory, like JP Nagar, were hit with the full force of the airborne attack. In 1984, these neighborhoods were just lean-tos with tin walls nailed together. No insulation, no real barrier keeping the gas from seeping straight inside. This resulted in thousands of people stampeding and thousands more dying in their sleep. The next morning revealed a scene of death, destruction, and heartbreak. Corpses lined the streets. Corpses of cows, of dogs, of people. Leaves had turned black. Birds had fallen out of the sky. And 10,000 people were dead. Union Carbide still exists today as a subsidiary of Fortune 500 company Dow Chemical, and its decaying factory still stands today in Bhopal. The gas tragedy was just the first disaster this factory caused. Present day, many lethal chemicals in the factory beyond MIC have leached into the groundwater supply and caused a water crisis worse than Flint, Michigan. Today, thousands of children are mentally and physically disabled, many of whom are children of gas survivors. However, while the gas tragedy may have rendered the survivors vulnerable, they are not weak. Rashida B. and her fellow survivor activists began their lives barred from jobs outside of the home, but they have become fierce advocates, leading near-biblical 500-mile marches on foot to Delhi and around the world, overcoming poverty, overcoming patriarchy, overcoming the narrow vision that the world told them their lives should be. At Chingari School, a special needs school that Rashida B. built for the children of gas survivors, Rashida B. talked to me about the power of womanhood and community that has fueled her through the years. She told me the hope she felt, knowing that the next generation of women will begin life knowing their power. I felt she was talking to me, a gas survivor's daughter, descended from Bhopalis who knew the city before its tragedy, who toiled in its aftermath to rebuild their lives and reclaim their homes. Baba was a judge in the prime of his career when the tragedy happened. Decades later, he was my research liaison, connecting me to his circle of colleagues. He was also my best friend, comforting me when the pain of the tragedy would overwhelm me. Baba inspired me to see the world for what it was and to confront the inequities in it. But Baba was also a judge in a government that had allowed a foreign corporation to cut corners in building and running a lethal factory. His colleagues oversaw compensation courts that were at best a bureaucratic labyrinth and at worst, completely corrupt. Compensation was delayed for years due to an extended legal fight. Behind closed doors, it was judges and lawyers that decided to settle the case for 1/7 of what was asked for. When compensation was finally paid in the 90s, almost a decade after the disaster, survivors received a few measly $100 per dead loved one. As I struggled with the paradox of Baba's memory, I remembered the reasons we had discussed underpinning the disparity in the death toll the government reported, around 2,000, and the one estimated by researchers, over 10,000. How the logistics of counting the dead, most of whom did not have birth certificates, were immense, and how the politics of saving face for a nation not yet 40 years old was of global consequence. And I saw that no individual or institution is morally absolute. I considered my own positionality. I am a gas survivor's daughter, but my family escaped the worst effects of the gas. In my research, I expected differences along gender and religion lines, but the starkest differences were driven by class. My family, like many of the wealthier Bhopalis, lived at higher elevation, benefiting from the literal inequities built into the city's geography. After the tragedy, my dad's life went back to normal. He landed himself a job in the US, I grew up in America, and we turned from survivors into visitors. As we enter the third year of another disaster, COVID-19, Bhopal has much to teach us. What does it mean to survive a disaster? Walking around Bhopal, past my Baba's house, down Idgah Hill, past courtrooms and hospitals, the memory of a crisis gives common things profound meaning. Each disaster creates a new class of inequities, and time erases the evidence of the violence that caused them. Hills become life-saving, valleys the opposite. COVID has disproportionately impacted the disadvantaged. Like MIC in Bhopal, it has targeted the marginalized. Wealth has insulated us from the brunt of COVID's impact, just as elevation and literal insulation determine who survived the tragedy. And the toll will be generational. How will the children born today remember the current disaster? Some will never know life without a mask. Some will never know the parents they have lost, the aunts and uncles suffering from long-term COVID disabilities. Yet others will know it as nothing more than a sentence in their social studies textbook. If we're lucky, maybe a chapter. And I know what you're thinking. Apoorva, no offense, but this is bigger than Bhopal. It's global, it's impacted all of us. We're not gonna forget this. And my question to you is, aren't we already? The survivors continue to demand justice today. Their stories are barely known in the rest of Bhopal, let alone the rest of India and the world. The comfort of forgetting too often overpowers the pain of confronting what has happened. But across the street from the Union Carbide factory gates, the activists have erected a statue. The statue is of a woman with one arm hiding her face in a sob, another arm clutching her child to her breast, while another child trails behind her. Behind the statue is the colorful neighborhood of JP Nagar, no longer a slum, but a neighborhood of small brick buildings painted in bright pastel colors. Inside the neighborhood, you can hear the mosque calls to prayer 5 times a day, mixing in with the Hindu temple broadcasting the morning prayer song. Inside the neighborhood, the residents suffer. They have been suffering every day since 1984 and before. But more importantly, they live. My social studies textbook was wrong. Bhopal was not the second worst industrial disaster in history. It is the worst, and it continues today. But that one sentence led me to a year of listening to the stories of Rashida B., Baba, and other survivors, which led me here, retelling them to you. I'll leave you with the words of another survivor activist, Hazra B.
I believe we have victory only when history remembers our fight. I want our stories printed in books. Coming generations will continue the fight by reading and remembering us. That will make sure Bhopal does not happen again.
Thank you.